Okay, so it is my pleasure today to introduce Minna for our seminar series. I'm really happy she accepted to present here. And all of you know Minna, but just a very brief background. So she worked in the area of body interaction, sensory motor interaction, and how our sensory motor experience shape our understanding of tasks we're doing, the environment, and so on. She has also a very complex background. She started from music and composition and went into science and technology communication, and then moved into the area of embodied interaction, looking closer to HCI, where she's going to present her work related to the PhD she has done at the Institute of Education. So she's been at UCL for quite a number of years. How many?
10 years and 1 month.
Okay. And then a couple of years ago, she moved to UCLIC, where she's working with me across the project, and she's really making a big contribution to this project, bringing her perspective on how we look at body movement in relation to textile engagement, understanding, and design, and also informing the design of robots from the perspective of touch, tactile interaction, and again, how we shape communication through touch between people or with objects. And now I let the stage to Minna.
Thank you, Nadia. And hello, everybody. My name is Minna Nygren. And as Nadia mentioned, I've been UCLIC now for a few years, but working in adult social care and touch-related work. And now I will present you some work that I did before I arrived at UCLIC at UCL Knowledge Lab, which is just a stone throw away from here. And I worked with Professor Sarah Price, who supervised my PhD. I'm going to show a few insights around movement and design and HCI related themes today. Just a kind reminder, I'm going to show some video data with children, and whilst I have the permission to share it with you, I won't have the permission to recordings to be shared onward. So thank you for understanding. So as Nadia already mentioned, helpfully and kindly, I have been working in the area of embodiment and embodied learning for the past 8 or so years. I did my PhD here at UCL on enactive engagement, which I will talk a little bit about in the next half an hour. And currently I'm working on touch-related research and social care. And these are 2 projects that I worked on previously, so Move to Learn for Teachers and Move to Learn. And I'll say a little bit about those as well. So when I look at movement and young children's engagement, I'm interested in these types of whole body interaction environments and installations that you can see, especially in places like museums. And they're designed essentially to afford children and their families opportunities to engage not only with the environment, this playful, beautifully designed environment that you can see here. For example, this is called River of Grass installation, and it's in Miami, Florida. And the environment is designed to convey the experience of this fragile natural landscape called Everglades. And children can move around and they can interact with some of the elements that have been designed for. So there are some movement-based detectors on the top and on the sides, and children can move around and through gesture and also through some physical objects engage with the environment, explore different elements of the Everglades. And there's just a little bit of the way in which the sensors are placed. Now, that experience was designed in 2016, but these technologies have been around for many years, over 10 years, we've been seeing these kinds of experiences in museums. Here is one experience from Beijing in China that was launched 2 years ago. This is a little bit different. It's more sort of creative, exploring with colors, patterns, creating almost graffiti type of experiences. So less of a thematically linked to ecology, for example, as the first example, but more of an exploration of how movement may be used to create things, to visualize some aspects of movement in the environment. There are also experiences designed for very abstract types of experiences, such as this piece is called Aura, and it's very abstract. You move together with your friends, and it's all about social interaction. So it detects different bodies in space, and the lights and sound will change according to where you are and with whom. I wanted to also share this installation by Chris Milk, The Treachery of Sanctuary from 2012, because it's very relevant to the work that I've been doing. And this is a movement mirroring type of experience where the person's body movements are quite accurately detected and mirrored by the movement detection system. And then there is a very artistic, poetic kind of bird flocks experience. And you're interacting together with others, but everybody has like their own mirror next to each other. This was at the Barbican a while ago. But what's interesting to me is what is in those experiences meaningful for children, especially. And there is some work around how children make meaning through action. And we know that for children's development, action plays a hugely important role. We know from early writings by the likes of Dewey and Piaget that sensory motor engagement, that being our senses and motoric, our movement, our body movement, are integral to how we learn about the world. And since then, there has been a lot of work done in different kinds of learning activity spaces, including digital experiences by Yvonne Rogers and Sarah Price, and different ways to conceptualize the active engagement in different learning spaces with digital technology. However, what's still missing is the understanding of the detail of how those gestures and actions may support young children's meaning-making, learning, experiencing, especially in collaborative environments where children interact together with others. Let's look at whole body interaction a little bit, what's been done in this area. The body movement is intrinsically motivating activity for children. And so this kind of whole body interaction is quite an interesting topic to look at when it comes to children and the opportunities to design experiences for children. This example is by Rob Lindgren and his colleagues from a few years back. It's called Meteor, and Rob Lindgren works in this field that's called embodied learning. And he's interested in embodied metaphors. And by that, we mean that, for example, in this installation, a child can embody the movement of a meteor and experience moving through this floor projection, through this celestial landscape, if you can see it, different kinds of trajectories and different speeds. Now, in these post-interaction interviews with children who were, I think, about 9 years old in this study, they were describing how they really felt like they had embodied the meteor. And they were running through this space and they said, wow, I really embodied this celestial experience. I was moving around like a meteor, and they had this joyous experience. And it seemed that it was more than just fun of the intrinsically motivating movement, but they were also taking away something else, something about the meaning of what it's like to move as a celestial body across space. However, of course, this was with a child per time, so we didn't really get insights into what it's like for children to experience such space and experience together with others. Beyond this kind of whole body engagement, meaning-making movement experiences, we also know empirical research demonstrates that the way in which children experience the world affects how they narrate about their experience through gesture. This is a study by Rhiannon Thomas Jha and colleagues from UCL Knowledge Lab. I also worked on this study. It was around children interacting with different kinds of water table toys. Water tables are these kinds of areas you might have seen in museums or even in nurseries or schools like this study was made in. And they can explore water flow and different ways in which water dynamically moves through cups and pumps and tubes of different shapes and sizes. And this one is interesting study design because then in the post-interaction, the children were asked, so what did you notice about the water going through the pipes? And the children would get up and they would actually reenact the pump and they would say the water went through. They embodied essentially that toy and they were expressing and narrating essentially that experience that they had had at the water table. So this is an important example that demonstrates that these 4 to 5-year-old children may not be able to tell you about the dynamics of water movements with words, but they will be able to tell you in detail how the water moved, for example, through that particular object. And this is well known in research in child development that movement and bodily expression and nonverbal communication is really essential for communication. And I think this plays really nicely into thinking about designs in digital spaces, because if we have movement-based interactives, how could they then those experiences lend themselves for children to have opportunities to communicate about them afterwards? This could be a way to access children's experience. This perspective and active cognition is helpful, I think, in thinking about movement and action and children's experience. And active cognition essentially asks us to consider the perception and action in interaction. So essentially, what is happening when a child is playing with the water toys? What are they attending to? Where is their attention? What object do they grab and how do they actually begin to manipulate it? Also, interestingly, there is the work by Sean Gallagher is relevant here in terms of social inaction. So that collaborative aspect that I was talking about earlier. Now, how could we understand if we have a dyad or a group of children, how could we understand what role does gesture and action play in the environments where we have more than one child? And essentially, as I said, enactive cognition invites us to look at the detail of that interaction to understand what caught that child's attention when they were interacting in that space and how essentially are they engaging? How are they moving? How are they moving together with other children? We did some work in this area of social collaboration and enactive cognition around, again, water tables. We did a study on grandparents interacting with young children. These were 3 to 6-year-olds. So again, that age where sensory motor engagement and nonverbal communication is an important part of that stage of development. And our study demonstrated that children were engaging in these types of action exchanges. So when there were 2 or more children, they were shaped, their interaction with the objects was shaped by the way in which the grandfather was noticing different aspects of the environment, of the objects, how the water was moving. Noe called it enactive potentialities, that there are different kinds of ways in which we can, for example, use a cup. So here in this study, the use of cup was essential. We had transparent cups where water would flow through. And in this particular illustrative example, Matthew, this boy, was lifting a cup up on top of these spoons. It was like a wheel of spoons, and when you would drop water on it, the wheel would spin. And he was saying at some point how he was doing this kind of movement, and he was saying, oh, it goes faster when I go up. And he was going up like this. And they then began this exchange with the grandfather, who used another cup, and he was showing different types of movements around the wheels. And so eventually they came to a mutual understanding through a shared action around what affects the speeds of the wheel. And after the interaction, in a post-interaction chat that we have with Matthew, he was demonstrating in real detail about how the water had come out from that cup. So again, with words, we may not have known as much about Matthew's experience, but through these nuanced details in the gestural narrating of the experience, we could say, okay, Matthew actually noticed different kinds of ways in which the water was moving out and what was affecting the speed of the wheel. I'll talk next about my PhD, which is in this space still, but we'll now move back into the whole body interaction space and the digital space. And looking at young children's collaboration. I'll show you some of these prompts that I started with to invite and encourage young children to engage in exploring different kinds of actions. So to do that, I designed several different kinds of prompts. Some were visual, and some were digital, and some were these toys. And I'll say a little bit more about this. So I drew from the literature on embodied cognition and body-based metaphors. I thought about a very simple embodied metaphor, big and small. And I mapped it to sound. And so if you were to move your hands wide apart, if you imagine there's a sine tone in between your hands, you would essentially create a lower pitch because there'd be more space in between each cycle of the sine wave. And then when you bring your hands together, you'd create a high tone. Alongside that, I created a storybook with magic pause that we read together with children. And I was interested in how they will respond to this kind of prompt, whether they would start to action and explore that movement on their own whilst we were exploring this kind of story. And then I had a slinky toy that was the closest sort of physical toy that I could find that was related to the sine wave idea and the embodied metaphor of big and small. And then eventually, after having done the physical sort of very low-fi prototype stage, I moved into a digital installation prototype that I developed over a few iterations. And this is what it looked like. So in the I hope this is better. I hope that online guests can still hear me. Yes, Mark is nodding. Great. So I did two activities in these studies with young children. I showed them this storybook that I mentioned earlier with this story-based fictional narrative around moving sound with hands, changing sound with hands. And then the children got to experience this open-ended installation. I'd invite children to come and interact in groups of 3. This technology designed on the platform PoseNet could at that time cater for up to 3 people. So they could interact freely. And just to show you what that looked like, so when children were interacting, they could see the display in front of them. And there were many kinds of movements that children came up with, all the way from this kind of exploratory interactions, such as moving arms, but also moving legs, making different kinds of faces in front of the system, and trying to almost trick the system as well. So go behind poles that were in the space. They would crouch down, and really the main kind of effective tone was this joyous exploration through movement, trying out all different kinds of bodily ways of moving, engaging different types of movements, jumping, playful interactions, hide and seek, changing different ways of moving arms around. But not only were they exploring playful interaction and essentially their own agency over this stick person figure on the screen, they also expressed awareness of each other. If you can look at the boy in the middle, he's noticing what the girl on the left is doing, and they're kind of mimicking each other, but they're also building upon each other. And I found this really interesting because it demonstrated that whilst they had this very engaging stick person figure in front of them, they also displayed awareness of each other. So it wasn't just that they were looking in front of themselves. Of course, they would then also see the other person's stick person moving. So there was this ongoing attentiveness towards each other as well. So the interaction in this space was really marked by this continuous manual gesturing around that metaphorical action that I showed you earlier. That was the sign, tone, visualization, the red wriggly line that they could change the shape of. But beyond that, this built into whole body movements. And as I showed you, they were also doing these jumpy movements. They were doing dancing movements. They were combining essentially and exploring how could we also move in other ways, not just with this kind of horizontal or upwards, downwards movement. And they were evoking these types of narratives essentially in that moment. So not only were they interacting with the metaphorical action, but they were displaying different kinds of role play narratives. And I'll show you in a moment what that looked like. They also reenacted different kinds of cultural body memories, I call, because they were essentially bringing from their own movement repertoire that they had developed already by that early age into the system to try out how we would interact, how we would change, how we would be affected. So you remember the storybook that I showed you with the magic pause. The children were bringing that story into the digital environment. So essentially they were doing a kind of a digital reenactment of what they had experienced in the story. And they also were using quite a few verbal descriptions on how I'm now the wolf or how I'm now maybe another role such as Superman. And there were these nuances to all these different kinds of roles and pretend play that they were doing, which I found, again, very interesting because it demonstrated that children were really expressing themselves through their whole body. So it was almost like a dialogue space, whole body dialogue space that they were creating. I'll show you a few clips of those types of interactions. It demonstrates some of what I call these body memories or cultural memories that they brought from their own experience from spaces such as Fortnite, where you can see these movements sort of prompts in digital video games these days. These characters all have their own movements. And so they were trying out, here's another one, with children reenacting a different kind of pose from a Fortnite, again, this kind of movement. And also, again, sort of picking up movement cues from each other and doing the similar kind of action to see how it affects the stick person. So there was this meaningful action in collaborating with each other, picking up movement cues from each other, building different kinds of movement narratives, pretend play narratives, and experimenting essentially with different kinds of nonverbal communication. So there were these whole body movements, but there were also those facial expressions and some really tiny details like grabbing the sound with like really strong hands. And they essentially were participating in a kind of a whole body dialogue, these children, where they could express themselves in a multitude of different kinds of ways. I also thought that this kind of space supports that attentiveness to one another and the ongoing visualization of not only just your own stick person, but the other children's stick persons as well as alongside each other was a kind of a constant reminder that there are others in this space. And I thought that the stick person is kind of like a blank canvas for all those role play and imagination that children were bringing in. So there was really an open space for exploration and developing ideas. And they could see each other's actions in front of them in the stick person, but they could also sometimes when they'd position themselves, one child will be here, another will be behind a little bit, they would then also see physically each other's body movements. And as you've seen in some of the data that I showed, hopefully you saw that they were attending to those actions because they would create their own versions of those actions and really respond to each other essentially as if it was a dialogue. So there are some challenges to designing in these spaces. Questions are there specific types of experiences or activities that children could engage that would be beneficial. Or, for example, we're doing a pilot project now with colleagues from UCLIC, so Nadia Bertous and UCL Knowledge Lab, starting in January, around this installation and experience, especially in kids who are just starting school, so 4 to 5 year olds. And we want to investigate how children who might not know each other that well yet, they might have not developed friendships with each other yet, how might they benefit from having an opportunity to interact in this kind of playful environment where you're not necessarily needing to face one another. There's some literature in this positioning oneself in dialogue that I find quite interesting, where if you've ever watched young children when they first get together and they don't quite know each other yet, they sort of tend to play next to each other rather than in front of each other. So it's a kind of a lighter way to get to know one another and how one likes to play. And yeah, museums or where else. So I've shown you plenty of examples of museums using these installations for families and children's enjoyment and interaction. But could they also find a place in other areas of our society? I don't know yet, but maybe. We're going to do this work in schools in January, so it will be a way to explore that area a little bit. And then there's this dilemma and issue of accuracy. There were these moments, so the detection system is getting better and better. You need to train the system, and it's not always accurate. And how you notice it? Well, for example, if you had a broom in the room, the system would recognize it as a fourth person. So that caused quite a lot of amusement, but also confusion amongst the children. So they would suddenly look like, oh, but there's nobody here, but there's a fourth person there. So, I mean, they found it generally very amusing after they first were puzzled by it. And then how we got around it was that I would bring a pencil or some straight long item and I would show them that, you know, this is the kind of way in which the system and the computer works. But they were really curious about that as well, about how the system works. And so it was an opportunity then for them to also engage with the technology itself. I'm developing some design sort of considerations around this space. I've talked about a few of them. I'm just going to mention a number 4. I'm not going to go through all of them in detail, but number 4 I thought is interesting, this kind of in and out of group interaction in this kind of space. So as they were interacting with this stick person themselves, exploring how does it work, if I move my legs, if I move my arms, what's happening, but then going kind of smoothly into group interaction as well. And then back again to this kind of individual play. So I thought that was an interesting aspect of this type of space and environment in terms of, again, going in and out from social to kind of solo experience. So to find out more about enactive engagement in this type of space, you're welcome to read my thesis. It's only 261 pages long. It's available at UCL repository. And I'm happy to talk about any of the work that we did with young children reenactment, those water table work as well, which has been published if you're interested. So on that note, I'll say thank you so much for your attention, and I'm really happy to take any questions. And I would like to thank my professor, Sarah Price, my second supervisor, Es McLeod, and research associate Rhiannon Thomas, and the Move to Learn project and Wellcome Trust, as well as all the children, schools, nurseries, and families that participated in this work. So thank you very much.
Question? Go ahead.
Yeah, really interesting range, yeah, and framing. There's lots there that is very rich. As you know, I'm also interested in activism, and one important idea in activism is around entrainment, shall we say? So I'm wondering when. So you talk about a lot of the meanings that you talk about are referring back to an immediate episode that just happens. Does the meaning making or sense making that you're observing, are you looking at how then ongoing activity or continued activity is sustained and altered through that meaning making?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. Entrainment behaviors, just to kind of say what it is from my perspective, it means these kinds of actions. If you've ever seen a jazz band play together, for example, and then suddenly they all come together to play the same theme, but then they go off and do some solo improvisation, for example, or in dance as well, they might do the same action, like those kids were doing the floss action at the same time, and then kind of finishing off. So that's one example of entrainment type of action. And these children were doing some of those types of actions, but what interested me most in this study was the collaborative building on each other's actions, type of unfolding in time, action exchanges and action chains. So I'm interested in how they pick up cues from each other and develop a dialogue. And it could be a kind of entrainment, I suppose, but really what they improvise around a shared theme is what I'm really looking at, and how they develop their own vocabulary almost of movement in that kind of space. So that would be one way that I would think about entrainment and in relation to collaboration.
But sorry, then, just to be kind of clearer on what I'm interested in. So that they've developed that vocabulary for movement. Are they then using that vocabulary? Do you see that reflected either in like another time that you talk to them or in their actual next time of movement? So I meant, so okay, exactly as you said there, in training and building off each other in that moment. But and obviously sometimes we design for just an interaction. But in this kind of context, we're thinking about things like learning. We might be thinking about building confidence for movement, exploring more movements, just kind of thinking slightly more longitudinally, or even like the very next session.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it links to, in my mind, it links to the kind of metaphor, for example, or the action that you design for. So in this case, the children were quite engaged in doing this type of action, for example, with the metaphorical action. They were all doing it at the same time. They were having moments of shared action, and they were enjoying that because they were all building on each other, reflecting verbally. Now we're all changing the sound like this, right? And I think that in the wider context of the bodily improvisation and the wider use of the bodily palette, I think for designers, the main thing to consider is how do you balance out in children's interaction, especially this designed for action that supports entrainment in some ways, possibly. And then the wider joyful interaction that does not necessarily include just this action and repeating it, reenacting it, but also the different kinds of jumping and clapping and different ways of moving. So I don't know if that sort of links. I don't know. The answer is I don't know. It requires longitudinal work, I think, to understand how does an experience that's rich in movement and whole body sort of expressing yourself support the child in their everyday life. So that's one of the key questions that we want to know more about in our project that starts in January as well. Hope that answers. It's more of a exploration of an idea, I suppose, but it's very interesting. I think that notion of entrainment. Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks for the great talk. And what I really like is this emphasis on using technology that's not all encapsulating, but having projections, having maybe a monitor, and then doing things together with others most of the time. Not always, but most of the time. Nonetheless, there has been this recent idea of having personalized tutors using, for example, LLMs to work at home. And there is, of course, this VR idea that one could do more with this in the future, which I'm not certain about whether this is a good idea or not. Nonetheless, children do spend significant time at home, or might be not with other small children. How do you envision that these experiences could also be leveraged, for example, at home, be it with smartphones, other devices, VR? I think this nicely ties into this question that you had at the end, museums and where else?
That's a good question. Thank you for that. I think there's an opportunity there from a technology and access perspective. This technology is essentially quite cheap. You don't need any special equipment. You need a webcam, and you need to know how to develop in JavaScript this PostNet environment. But that's essentially it, and it works in any browser. So that is a pro of the accessibility in the home environment. I did work with, as part of my PhD, I worked with families as well. So I understood that different age children with the parent interacting, there's a lot of supportive, again, intergenerational interaction opportunity that one could do at home, say supporting in a task on, I don't know, some form of spatialized learning, for example. And then maybe across, so you talked about remote. We did a workshop in IDC some years ago during the pandemic on remote whole body interaction and design, and we were exploring this. And beyond the many ethical questions that there are in terms of using these whole body interactors in design process, for example, social interaction and connecting with your family in a playful way through body movement, may be an interesting way to prompt children to express themselves non-verbally. So there is that kind of opportunity to explore a new way of a channel for children to express themselves, and then to have that grandparent on the other side of the planet, or whoever it is. I think those education at home, and actually those families that I worked with, many of those children were homeschooled. So they really found it quite beneficial, because they were describing how children don't really get to move around with other children, obviously, because they don't go to school. They do have group sessions and lessons, but not every day in the school environment. So that was something that they mentioned that they were lacking, and that's what was engaging for the parents with regards to this type of system.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe one additional question. At the beginning, you showed some of this work with the water, and that they could learn some physics based on this.
Yeah.
Later, it was more about visuals and group interaction. What are your takeaways regarding this physicality? Because at the end, one could argue that you have less physicality, and you could go into a more, let's take the example of Superman, a fictional area, or on the other one, it would be really more about learning. What do you think or what are your thoughts on the role of physicality and these different modalities like haptics, olfactory, etc., etc.?
That's a really interesting question, and I think it's so relevant to think in, especially about also special user groups, children with paralysis, or children who won't be able to necessarily do these kinds of complex movements. And I think the visual aspect is interesting and engaging. We know from mirror neuron studies that the brain is engaging in the way as if you were dancing with someone yourself when you look at someone dance. And I don't know what the relationship is. I think that's a really interesting question. I think there are different ways from an enactive perspective to enter and access ideas and our environment and perceptually access them in different kinds of ways. And from an embodied cognition perspective, any experience affords those opportunities for us to engage with the environment. And I'd say to the extent that to how that is available to us, you know, depending on our abilities in our body, we can engage with the world differently. I'm thinking about just the simple example of the cup again, that there are so many different ways in which you can manipulate a cup, and you come to know that if you grab it this way and the top is here and there's water inside, you know how to drink it because you've come to learn to use, and you've had that experience. But there are so many different ways of experiencing the world, and I think the digital installations and experiences demonstrate us that, and they probe us, and they challenge us to think, in what other ways is it possible to experience the world? And in this case, to support children's collaboration with one another.
No. So there's a hand up.
I had a similar question. Where I thought was interesting about. Initially, it was like a physical. It was a physical interaction with physical tools.
Yeah.
And then you demo the wave sound installation. To me, it's just it's the same. It's kind of like a digital tool, but you are still interacting with something. And what you meet through that process, you're making the meaning of what this system does. Kind of, you're trying to understand what you can do with it. So to me, from that perspective, the two examples are the same. So that was the question.
Thanks. Yeah, that is an interesting aspect, and I suppose the difference in these two examples is the kind of immediacy of expression. Like in the whole body interaction environment, you're immediately almost interacting and expressing to someone else what the experience is that you're having. Whereas in the first example, because of the way the study was done, it was more emphasis in what kinds of details had you gained from that experience, and then the child will be using the gesture to demonstrate those details spontaneously of what they had noticed.
There are people online, but I didn't see any questions so far.
No questions. Okay.
I have one question myself.
Yeah.
Did you see any transfer from, you know, they say it's difficult to express with words all this detail, what is going through their mind, but did you see or did you explore if there is a transfer afterwards between all the gesture they use to reenact that process? I'm thinking to the museum at the beginning, and to afterwards, when they explain those phenomena or interaction, if their verbal capability to become richer.
That's a great question, and the answer is no. So this is a big question for museums. Museums rely on demonstrating how their guests, how their visitors make meaning, what they take away from their experiences. They rely on those kinds of accounts to get funding from the government, for example. So they really want to be able to show that, oh, this child has taken away this experience. And this could be one way to start to investigate how does that child, after 4 months, for example, reflect on that experience in the Science Museum when they were at the water table. Some of the issues there are that, for example, relational issues. The teacher who took them to the museum might not be employed by the school anymore. And so, or they might have gone up in class. So that social and relational aspect's really important as well. As in these examples, when they were recounting those experiences, the parent was also present. So there was someone who was familiar to them. So that might also shape the way in which the child opens, expresses, and shows the different kinds of levels of detail. So I think that longitudinal is the next step to really understand what did those children take away from that experience, and how do they reflect on it much, much later. Yeah.
So I'm more talking about the instance where the child was explaining. I'm now aware of my hand movements.
Yeah.
The instance where the child was explaining the water with their hands. My question is, what kind of additional information does this, I don't know the terms, like embodied, enactive, like I'm doing it right now, but what information am I giving you? Like without my hands moving, do you get less from my conversation with you, or is it like emotional? Like, am I building emotional rapport, something like that? Like, I just wanted to know what your thoughts are on, like, I'm so aware of my hands moving now, I can't, like, what is it that this embodied language that we're sharing provides on top of the words that I'm actually saying?
That's a great question. I would say from the child developmental literature, all of those things that you mentioned, the narrative, the verbal description, on top of the hands maybe showing a detail of what you're telling me about water flow, or you're emphasizing something. There's a huge area of literature on gesture studies that have mapped out a whole cavalcade of different types of ways in which we use, adults mainly actually, how adults use gesture during, when they're speaking, when they're trying to make a point. But for example, in science museums, they have these explainers. I don't know if you've seen, when you go as a child, then you can see these explainers, they're called, and they will narrate to you what the experiences that you're having, so they can support, for example, gravity. They can show that, you know, this is about learning gravity, and the child will be like, oh, I understand, and then they mimic the gesture. So they may not be able to understand the word gravity, but they'll be able to pick up on different kinds of gestural ways of expressing that same idea. So for a young child whose verbal capacity has not yet fully developed, it's a really important way of expressing oneself. And I think that this is it's not very well explored yet, especially in how children can convey quite complex ideas, such as water flow, through their gesture and body movement. And just to wrap up, in an embodied way, the emotion, the effect, is always present in the way that you narrate. So the embodied cognition, my reading of embodied cognition, it doesn't differentiate between those different qualities of expression, but an affective quality may sometimes be foregrounded. So it might be like, I'm really expressing my joy right now, whereas in another moment, I'm really just trying to emphasize a point.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.